For this one, I really need to probably tell some of our own story. Caroline and I were blessed by God with 3 sons, and as they grew up, we mostly homeschooled them. We had family devotions, and you go to April of 2001. Our oldest was 19. He was away at college, then like 17 and 13. They all had made professions of faith, were baptized, were involved in church, loved to come to church. Our oldest son, who'd gone off to college at a private college in Virginia, was established in a good church there. He was involved in like pro-life stuff on campus. And although, we would, if you asked us, parenting's tough and you've got all this stuff to deal with, but really at that time it just seemed like everything had gone great. It's like we'd followed the formula. We'd tried to do the stuff in shepherding a child's heart, and it seemed that it had all turned out well. Then on April the 1st, 2001, we got a phone call from our son. We'd actually talked to him every Sunday afternoon. And our son, who was away at college, I think in his second year, revealed to us that he had turned from what we believe. He really had quit some time ago going to the church we thought he was going to. He had a Buddhist girlfriend. And he made it pretty clear that what she and he were doing together was none of our business, which made it figure out what we knew. And he declared that he was no longer under our authority and he was going to live as he wanted to live. And that's just the way things are going to be. By the way, that son is now teaching theology in Australia, but in a bad theology he's teaching. He's very liberal. But he's actually coming into our house tomorrow night. So we're going to be spending a few days with him. But at that time, he's 19 years old. And that began a real tough journey for us where we, for Caroline, just devastated. Caroline is the most cheerful, happy person I've ever known. She can see, if the glass is 1/8 full, she thinks that's great, which is good for me as the husband. And I've known Caroline since we were both 15. And up until that time, I could have taken all the tears I ever saw my wife, my friend, cry and put them in a thimble. But for the next few weeks, I would need a bucket. I remember the day after this happened, she just sat in the backyard and pulled weeds and cried all day long. April the 2nd, 2001. And that began a very challenging journey for us with our kids. And then my oldest son started to have influence on his youngest brother, who looked up to him as the big brother. And basically, from our perspective, they might have a bit different perspective, although I did give them freedom to read these books I wrote and to comment on them. But his older brother kind of convinced him that he was being raised by cult members and that he needed to go out into the world and find himself and be himself and not let our standards of certain things mess up his life. And the 13-year-old kind of bought into that, and we went through a great time. I mean, it was hard enough. By the time he was 14, 15, things were really, really hard. And so it's one thing to have someone 2,500 miles away. That was heartbreaking. But to have someone in the house who's fighting you everywhere, that was tough. And then our thought was, well, we always have the middle one. And the middle one continued to profess faith. And he went off to college, went to graduate school. He was living with us while he was working. And then when he was about 25 or 26 years old, he became a skeptic and left our church and doesn't go to church, he's an agnostic, atheist type person. Nice guy, but it's been a very, very hard journey for us. And interestingly, that in 2001, I'd been invited to speak at a conference, and they wanted me to come up with a topic. And so I had been counseling in lots of cases of parents who had teenagers with whom they were struggling. And so I prepared essentially the outline you have in front of you to teach at this conference about how I was helping other people with their problems. And then by the time I got to the conference, 6 months after whatever, I was talking about my own life in a way I never imagined would have happened. And even to this day, it's like we've been blessed in so many ways. We just had The Lord has blessed ministry. He's blessed marriage. He's blessed materially, provided for us so well. But this has been a lifelong heartache for us, and it's been a struggle. And actually, it was a few years later that Lisa Patrick, who by then was already well known and published, came to me and said, "Would you help me write a book about that?" And that's what became the book that Harvest House published maybe 10 years ago, called "When Good Kids Make Bad Choices." Again, bad title when publishers create bad titles. So we've already gone through the beginning of what would be in your outline in terms of why do kids turn out the way we do. We've covered that we as parents have influence, but they make choices, and ultimately we're dependent upon God's sovereignty. We've talked about the basics of parenting, that what do you do to prevent your kids from rebelling? Well, you discipline them while there is hope. You teach them in the Word in a gospel-focused way. You don't provoke them to anger. You confess when you're wrong. And then I would just say positively, the things I talked about last night about affirmation, not always criticizing and correcting, but affirming, even in an unbeliever, the good things that God is doing in their life, that they're not in jail. I'm so thankful you're not in jail. Might not be the best compliment to give your 17-year-old. But athletics, sports, school, things that in common grace are positive, not negative, even if they're not believers. Another thing that I think has been really important, I've just observed families, is having fun together. And sometimes you can be so busy just doing, okay, we're going to do family devotions, and we're going to do the discipline, and we're going to do the school, and playing and laughing, I think, are great things to do. But let's say you went to the parenting seminars, you read the books, you tried all the good stuff, and now you've got this 15-year-old girl, and you can just tell you've lost her heart, that she doesn't really like you very much anymore. Could be your 14, 16-year-old son. He's as disrespectful as he can get by with. He's lazy. He's attracted to the wrong kind of people. He's attracted to the wrong kind of entertainment. He's kind of hiding himself from you. And one author wrote, if you lose your child's heart, quickly put into action a plan to get the heart back, no matter what it takes to do it, no matter how much time, trouble, or money it takes. And there's certainly truth to that if you sense your child is turning away, no matter how busy you are, this is really important. It's going to be a time of your life that's going to determine a lot of how you feel about your kids, and you don't want to have regrets for having been so busy with your job or your hobby or whatever else it is. This is a crucial, crucial time. But then what do you do? And one would be you need to first deal with yourself. We talked about Matthew 7, right? Get the log out of your own eye. Do you have logs, parental logs in your parental eyes? Yes, you do. And again, the tendency of parents when their kid rebels is to go into lawyer mode and to justify themselves. And actually they become prophets, like the Old Testament, where the Lord would say to the prophet, I did all these things for you. We had this covenant together that I would do this and you would do that. And you violated the covenant, therefore condemnation is going to fall upon you. And in your mind, it all makes sense. And it's not that it's completely untrue. It's just not very profitable. And actually, one of the experiences I had, and I was in September of 2001, so you may remember what happened then. I actually met my son in England, and we went to L'Abri, which had been started by Francis Schaeffer, and to try to work on a relationship. And at that time, he was interested enough in Christianity, he was willing to go there. But the great shock to me, I went there to kind of have them help me fix my son. But I got there, and I realized I was in trouble when I realized, the people at this place, they've got these kind of people in their 30s who are running the place, who are kind of Christian philosopher, like little budding Francis Schaeffers. And they've got all these college age, a little older, mostly kids from America, some other countries, most of whom who grew up in Christian homes and are mad at their parents and mad at their pastors. I showed up as the only parent and pastor in the whole place. And as we met with one of the leaders there, I expected him to try to fix my son, who was involved in fornication and rebellion and all these obvious things. And the guy came after me and really admonished me strongly, especially for my expectation that I could control my son. When I was on my way over there, I read a book called Come Back, Barbara, written by Jack Miller, co-authored with his daughter, Barbara, now Giuliani. I actually met her for the first time recently, where it's a dialogue where this girl, pastor's daughter, rebelled, and I mean, like she's living with a drug dealer and doing all these horrible things. And in the book, the parents are confessing their own sin to God and to their daughter, and they're doing nice things for her. And I'm thinking, what do you mean? She's living with a drug dealer. Why are you being so nice to her? Why are you confessing your sin? It was really disturbing to me, but it was also, in its own way, kind of preparatory. And the Lord in my own life made me look at the logs in my own eyes. The forest of splinters in my son's eyes had been obvious to me. But seeing how I had failed to really express love adequately to my son, I was much more about everything running smoothly. That I don't think I'd been a very good listener. I had these things, like formulaic things, where I'm going to take each son out to breakfast or lunch once a month, and they actually kind of joke about it, like, what's today's sermon going to be at lunch? But not really as he was becoming an adult, listening to him and actually making it safe for him to tell me things that I might not want to hear. But if it's in his heart, I'd rather know it than not know it, and get over my illusion that I could somehow, by my force of instruction and personality, keep him believing what I believe, sometimes not making my faith attractive. But just the confession before God and my son that I can't control his mind and his heart. And that, like I talked about earlier, that I can present what I believe, what I know to be the truth, but I can't make him become what I want him to be. And I'd been trying to do that, and he didn't like it. And I had to humble myself before God. I sought my son's forgiveness for various things, tried to be open and vulnerable with my own weaknesses and struggles. And then just crying out to God. You have all these emotions. Some of you have been through this in a group this big, and you've raised a child, and somebody talked to me during a break, of unbelieving kids who are grown, and you're angry, you're ashamed, your heart is broken, and just cry out to God like in the Psalms. And my wife had a friend during some of the worst of this, and they would take a day and they would have prayer and fasting. And not a formula. Doesn't get your kid automatically saved. You'll fast every Tuesday for a year or something, but it brought comfort from the Lord. Seeking godly counsel, Proverbs 11:14, in abundance of counselors there's victory. Now, most people we would talk to would give us, you were great parents. I don't know what's wrong with them. And, you were just wonderful and it's all their fault. Or it would be, I know they'll come back. You did great, and they will misuse the proverb. Oh, he's going to come back. You just know he's going to come back. I actually had a famous evangelical leader whom I sat with in an airport one time. I'd been like a little breakout speaker at a conference where he was the big speaker, one of the big speakers. And shortly after, this is in the early 2000s, and I told him my story, he was very kind to me, was very interested, but then he kind of put his hand on me and says, in the name of the Lord Jesus, your son will come back this year, or something like that. And then I went to Deuteronomy 13 and tried to find stones, and no. His theology of prediction was inaccurate. He meant well. He was trying to comfort me. But that was not good counsel, because the Bible doesn't promise that every wayward son will come back. Eli's sons didn't come back. They perished in their unbelief. So just don't ask people who are going to say what you want to hear or take your side. And I was blessed by fellow elders at our church who, and actually when we dealt with the second son, that was in some ways harder because he was still around. And they gave good counsel. They also made me deal with where I'd been wrong. Like I'd worked in Saudi Arabia in 1981 to 87. I'd been invited back to a similar place in the Middle East to do ministry. And they said, cancel the trip. Oh, just They said, if you need to get out of the pulpit for a period of time, they weren't kicking me out of the pulpit, but they actually met together. So, is there an issue of qualification? And they concluded that we'd been faithful as parents, that we weren't responsible for outcomes, but they also said, you're in a crisis right now, and your future qualifications are going to be determined by how you handle this, and that means this is your priority. So you cut out outside speaking engagements. We can or others can fill the pulpit if you need time off. Spend time with your family and do everything you can. And that was good counsel. I didn't like it, all of it at the time. And even they say, well, we've been observing you. We've known you all these years. We'd been together over 10 years by that time. And these are weaknesses we saw that we probably should have talked to you about. You need to work on that. You, in your own heart, need to recognize the sin of your child for what it is. So often you'll see this on TV, like some 14-year-old shoots up a school or something and say, well, he's a good boy, he just got in with the wrong crowd. No, he's a bad boy. It's not genetics, he's not sick, it's not that he needs medication. If he's sinning, it's sin. He's not just going through a phase, and he's responsible for his foolishness. And then you may be prepared for the fact he's not a believer. I already talked about how we dealt with that. I've had people say, well, but I remember when she was 5 years old and she, in her bed, invited Jesus into her heart. And speaking personally, I really believe God can save really little kids. And I've known people who trusted Christ at a very young age and they've stayed with it. But there are kids who make professions of faith, and in some sense they may think they're sincere at the time, but they're not yet regenerate, and it's because all their friends are doing it, or that's what they think their parents want, and time will tell. The parable of the soils applies to all ages, including little kids, right? And not everything that pops up stays alive. And the problem with your child may be that he's lost and he needs salvation. Recognize you're not in control. Paul Tripp writes, you will never control the heart of your teenager. You cannot create the change that needs to take place. I'm not saying you can't do anything, but the change that needs to take place is a change you yourself cannot create with your own powers. You cannot do by human force what only the grace of God can accomplish. So that's dealing with yourself. I had the illusion that if I just parented hard enough and did it the right way, my kids would all turn out great. I knew if you gave me a multiple choice test, I would have said false. But in my heart of hearts, I still thought so until I was confronted with the other reality. And then another general thing was just take care of your family. One really troublesome child can wear you out, but then the other kids can be neglected. And you need to take care of your marriage and still do the things we talked about earlier today and last night. And because a lot of times when rebellion happens, there's blame going on. You know, if you hadn't been so strict, he wouldn't have rebelled. Well, if you hadn't been so loose and been more loving, that you can turn on each other instead of just confessing, boy, this is heartbreaking and this has got to be so hard for you and forgive me for I fell short and vice versa, not blaming each other. And then not neglect your other kids. Because, part of the deal too is it's really time consuming to deal with a rebel, and it's an emotion-consuming thing. And then in terms of dealing with the rebellion itself, we talked about we use the analogy of warfare. And I don't mean you're attacking your son. It means you're fighting for your son or your daughter. But the war analogy is good because it's like, probably not many people here have lived through a real war when our nation's existence was at stake. But my mom would talk about during World War II, like they didn't have butter and they didn't build new cars and you're on a war footing. You radically change everything because this is important. It's kind of the advice my elders gave me. And there are two sides of what needs to be done. One is discipline and the other one is love. And it's a two-pronged defense against the rebellion of your child. On the discipline side, one is you need to be prepared to do some investigation. Thinking of a teenager, it is the glory of kings to search out a matter. A fundamental characteristic of a rebellious teenager is deceit, right? They're living a double life and they're doing everything in their power to keep you from knowing what they're doing. They're sneaky and they're good at it. And they're going to hide from you that they're looking at pornography, smoking pot, taking other drugs, sleeping with the boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever they're doing you don't like, shoplifting. They're going to do everything they can to conceal that from you. They're going to demand more privacy. And the thing that we explained to our kids when they were living in the home is that if you're living in our home and you're minors, you do not have an absolute right to privacy. It's not in the Constitution for you. And we have the right, back in the day it was for us as email, texting, now it could be cell phone if you let them have one, is that we have the right to come into your room and search it. Because they're doing everything they can to hide stuff from us. And I'm with our youngest son, when we realized, we saw the smoke, we started looking for the fire. And what I found was very disturbing in terms of when I got into his emails and his texts and his internet history, and found out some things I never told my wife, how bad some of it was. Now, I'm not saying every one of you go home and search your kids' rooms if things are going well, but you're not going to find out. They're going to do everything they can to lie. And your enemies lie to you. They don't give you the truth. They're treating you like an enemy. And then you have to do, when you see bad things, you have to remove the bad things from their life. He who walks with the wise will be wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. And so if they're around certain people who are dragging them into substance abuse, immorality, other rebellion, radical steps to get them out of that, pull them out of the school. I mean, it's not going to change their heart, okay? This is all external. Their heart will still yearn for those things. I knew one family that was living in Alaska, and their 15-year-old was smoking pot, so they tried to move to Southern California to get away from... I'm not kidding, okay? You're all laughing because you know where this is going, right? So, I mean, they're like 3 days in Southern California, and he found a bunch of guys just like his friends in Alaska, and he was smoking pot again. But there are other things you could try to do to keep your kid from smoking pot. You're doing what you can. Owning a cell phone is not the right of every teenager. Driving a car, other things. Things they're going to use. You're not responsible to finance a rebellion against God and yourself by giving them money and instruments of rebellion. When trust is lost, it has to be regained, or they can live a pretty narrow life. When we kind of figured out what our 15-year-old was doing, there was about a year when it was almost like he was handcuffed to my wife. Tough for her, tough for him, where we hardly let him out of our sight. And we kind of gave him a choice. It's either this or you go live somewhere else where it's going to be a lot tougher. Your decision. And he chose to stay. We're glad for that. But we could not trust him to be on his own. Establishing clear and reasonable expectation. This is really about discipline. There's a chart in the book of kinds of examples of, it could be curfew. Those who get drunk at night. Entertainment standards, make no provision for the lust of the flesh, immorality, impurity, greed must not be named among you. Being respectful. He who curses his father or mother, his lamp will go out. The Bible teaches saying nasty things to your parents as being a very serious sin. And it's not in self-defense, it's for the honor of God, who is the ultimate authority. Church involvement, that's going to be a question with adult kids in terms of how long do you make them keep going to church, but you can come and sit respectfully as a 15-year-old. We don't trust to leave you at home anyway, so you're coming with us and you can behave. And he may sit there and everybody in the room knows he didn't want to be there, but he can at least not disrupt. Obviously, substance abuse. I actually would keep in my office these little drug testing kits you can get online or at a drugstore, where, if you want to continue to live here, if you want to, when I tell you to pee in the cup, and or I'll take you to a facility. If trust has been lost, this is an opportunity for you to regain trust. But you're not going to misuse substances. And then a huge one, this will come up with the adult kids as well, is work. We talked about the sluggard's field, is that laziness leads into all kinds of other temptation and evil, idleness. And if you're going to live here, you're going to do your school or your job or whatever, you're going to be busy. He who sleeps in harvest is a son who acts shamefully. We've got dress code. This is a challenge. This is actually in general kind of expectations of teenagers. Again, you've got these extremes where many of us as parents would think, yeah, I'd like my daughter to be wearing kind of a loose-fitting, long-sleeved, baggy dress that goes down to her ankles. I'd like her to listen to Bach or maybe the Gettys are okay, when she's walking around, and, I want her to watch, whatever, only this stuff, maybe Disney movies, or even some of those are a little bit risque. So you have these ideals, and then you got, on the other hand, as long as you're living in my house, you're not going to be playing loud music about killing police and doing mayhem, and you're not going to watch these videos in our home, and there are going to be you're not going to watch pornography on the internet or whatever the rules are. And then there's this kind of thing in between, like I mentioned the green hair earlier, where you give them choices depending on their responsibility, where they can choose things you would not choose, but that's part of them becoming adults. Soon they're going to be making all their own choices. And so an example would be dress, where you'd like extreme modesty. There's a standard where if you cannot walk out of our house looking like that. And then that's not really what I had in mind, but I'm not going to make a fight over it. And this middle area will grow bigger as they get older and they show themselves to be more responsible, but it's going to require some self-control. We tend to be too controlling sometimes. We want to control everything over here, but when your child is in his or her mid to late teens, your time of control is almost over. And if they don't start making good decisions on their own, it's not going to happen. There need to be consequences. I'll use this with the adult kids as well. Proverbs 26:3 says, a bit for the horse, a bridle for the donkey, and a rod for the back of a fool. What that's saying is foolish people like donkeys don't do the right thing out of their love for Jesus and their love for their parents. They do the right thing because it's painful to do the wrong thing. And that's the foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. And so there have to be consequences for violating the rules. If they're living in your house, and I'm not saying the death penalty, kick them out or whatever for every little thing, but there has to be a price to be paid. I've had parents get really creative with this, where one family in Orange County, they had a young man who was very sassy to his mother, and they bought like 100 bricks at Home Depot. And they put them in one corner of the yard, and when he would say something nasty to his mother, they'd say, okay, like 15, 16 years old, the next thing in your life will be these bricks will move from this corner of the yard to this corner of the yard. And your life is over until that is done. It may be bread and water or something, but that there will be no phone, internet, friends, recreation. Parents can have a tough time with this. That could be hockey practice, things where, oh no, but he will not make the all-star team. Well, there are consequences in life for foolish behavior. It can be, maybe you live on a farm or something and make them do work or whatever, but there have to be consequences. I don't think you can spank someone who's your size. The Bible doesn't say keep spanking them forever. But there has to be pain generated in correspondence with the fault. Also, you want to appeal to his heart. It's the heart where the foolishness is. You speak, you take advantage of opportunities. You may take him, hopefully, to a Christian doctor. Is there anything going on physically? I've had friends, even in our movement, where they had children who were really struggling, and they learned later that some of the behavioral struggles these kids were having, in one case, part of his brain hadn't developed. And this wasn't just some airy-fairy psychobabble. This was brain scan, this thing isn't working. So it explains how it's hard for him to do things that would not be so hard for a normal teenager. And then you as parents have to be united. That means you talk and agree. Rebellious kids love to divide and conquer. They're good at it. I think maybe Dobson says it, and the problem is that you've got only so many hours a day to work on this. It's their full-time job is to try to get around you. And then don't make empty threats and let yourself be manipulated. I was actually counseling a family with about a 15-year-old daughter. She was the mother's daughter, a stepdaughter to the father, the dad, and very rebellious, stubborn girl. And she looked, with me in the room, and she looked at her dad and said, if you don't let me have my way, I'm going to call CPS and say that you're molesting me. I said, well, is he molesting you? No, but I'm going to call CPS. What do you do? I said, well, here's a phone. And I'll trust God to judge between you and me. But I can't let you do this. I'm not going to give you your way either way. Also, don't make stupid threats. If you say, if you do this, you're grounded until you're 20, you're not going to be able to, you're just going to look foolish. So be measured. And then the positive side is mount a love offensive. Psalm 103. Just as a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. He has not treated us He has not rewarded us according to our iniquities. He has not dealt with us according to our sins. This is maybe the most important thing I will say about this topic, and that is that, the part about discipline is obvious. You don't want your kid out fornicating and doing drugs. But the part of it's really hard to love someone who's made your life miserable, who's shattered your dreams, who's broken the heart of your spouse. And this is the aspect of my life more than any other way. I've had to try to learn to love the way that God has loved me. And to say there's nothing you can do that will make me stop loving you. That doesn't mean you can have your way on everything. And quite frankly, it's easier to say that sometimes than it is to feel that. We need a lot of the gospel in our own hearts to be able to keep going when things are really tough. Whatever discipline you enact has to be love and not revenge. The temptation is, again, when somebody hurts my wife, my flesh wants to hurt them back. When my sons broke my wife's heart, my temptation was to avenge that, and that's not what God has called me to. Vengeance belongs to God. My job involves discipline, but that's to be restorative and corrective. And then find ways you can show love to your rebellious child without compromising your values. He would say, yeah, if you love me, give me an iPhone 10, a credit card, and a car, and we'll be fine. I say, none of those things will be good for you in my judgment. But to show them surprising love and kindness. And in the book I talk about when our 15, 16-year-old was so hard for us. Again, it's like I talked about last night about affirming. You affirm what is affirmable. And he had a great love for music. And thankfully, the music he loved, he liked bluegrass, he liked opera, he liked... and we decided that's something we could encourage him in, that in common grace was a good thing. So we paid for the violin, we paid for the guitar, we paid for the music lessons. In San Diego, there are a lot of concerts. I'm sure there are here. And we would go, and we'd go watch the bluegrass people or classical or opera. And we would just try to find ways. It's not going to hurt him, and we would go. And I remember it was tough sometimes because I remember we bought tickets to one concert, and we're sitting there. We've taken this concert, which I'm sure I had other things to do. And when he saw there were empty seats over there, instead of sitting with us, he goes and he sits 35 seats over. And Caroline next to me, she could feel me getting hot. She just put her hand on my arm. It's kind of like, this is not a time to fight about this. The Bible doesn't say you have to, obviously it's disrespectful, but it's not a battle to be fought right now. So just to put up with, I could be home right now doing important things, and here I am sitting at a concert, and he won't even appreciate it. Just surprise them with grace. And in the case of this guy, a few years later when he went off to college and got a cell phone, interesting, he would call mainly his mom, sometimes me, when he'd be walking between classes, and suddenly just talking all the time to us. But he would bring up, say, I remember when you took me to that concert in Poway, and I said, that was really kind of you. I remember that. You didn't get immediate dividends for that investment. But in the long run, and we've talked about it since then, he had this sense that he saw we were trying. He saw he was trying himself. And be willing to show grace. Another thing would be seek help wherever you can find it. Teenagers who are in rebellion, the last people in the world they really want to be honest with is their own parents, and yet often they're kind of scared. They've not been young adults very long. And they'd like to have somebody they kind of think is on their side. If you can find somebody that's acceptable to both of you, and even let that person know some private... obviously your child is doing life-threatening behavior. There's a limit to confidentiality. But let them talk to somebody where they can express all this angst and upsetness they're having. And We actually had an unsaved relative that I tried to get my son to talk to like other elders in the church. Well, they were part of the conspiracy as far as he was concerned. But when he talked to an unsaved relative he liked a lot, and that guy said, "Your parents love you. Don't be an idiot. Don't ruin your life right now by..." Even in common grace, this relative could see, and that was a tremendous help. And then just don't give up. They've got these movies about Winston Churchill. We'll fight them on the beaches, and we'll fight them. That's really what I'm not going to give up. Nothing will make me give up. But what about an incorrigible kid? The Bible teaches there is such a thing as an incorrigible kid. This is a weird verse to be, another strange verse to be using in a parenting meeting, but Deuteronomy 21 verses 18 to 21, some of you know what it is. When my mom became a Christian shortly after I did, she actually taught me where this passage was. It says in verse 18, Deuteronomy 21, "If any man has a stubborn and rebellious son, he will not obey his father or his mother, and when they chastise him, he will not even listen to them. Then his father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gateway of his hometown. They shall say to the elders of his city, 'This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard.' Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death. For so you shall remove the evil from your midst, and all Israel will hear of it in fear." Now, that's either funny or disturbing, depending on how you respond to that. This is part of the Old Covenant theocracy, and we're not under the Old Covenant law, and some of us wouldn't be here if we were. But it's still part of God's infallible word with principles that I think are valuable for us now. And this wasn't a bad law. If you have a theocracy, a rebel causing havoc, it's kind of the equivalent of you've got to get them out of there. They're going to corrupt the whole nation. And that was the drastic, just judgment of God upon a rebel who would be trouble. And that in the church, we don't kill people, but we excommunicate them for the same reason. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. You got to get them out of there. Well, in Israel, that's how you got rid of them. But there are principles that remain that are very important. One is there is such a thing as an incorrigible child. And some of you have seen this. Diligent parenting, even this love offensive and discipline offensive I was describing, doesn't always produce the desired result. We counseled a couple who had a 16-year-old son who was just built like this. He was 240 pounds, just solid, big, strong guy. And no matter what his parents did, they took the door off of his room. He just would walk out the door, and unless you tackled him, which wasn't probably advisable because he was bigger than the two parents combined, he'd just go off and say, "I'm going to go smoke pot with my friends and shoplift. See you later." It's just that, not quite that blunt, but that's what was going on. And at one point, he threatened his mom with a knife in the kitchen when she tried to get him to do something. There are kids like that. Psychologists have recognized there are kids like that. And parents can be a bad influence that contribute to that, but people can rebel against good parents and turn out like that also. But another principle is that children are held responsible for their choices, okay? You don't take the parents out and stone them for being bad parents. The parents are saying, "We tried to control this guy, he's out of control." And so children, he made the choice, this wicked son. Now, but he wasn't a 6-year-old who was lying and breaking things. It's a glutton and a drunkard. It's a young adult. But then we're also to be concerned that if you've got somebody like this around, it says you shall remove the evil from among yourselves, that if you've got a 17-year-old like that in your house, and you've got a 15, a 13, and 11-year-old, you got trouble, right? And if he's so disruptive that other people are not safe physically, like this mom with the kid with a knife, or he's recruiting people to join his rebellion, which is the other principle, you may need to be prepared to take some drastic measures. It's not stoning. We're not under the Old Covenant. God reaches this point he divorces Israel or kicks him out of the house as a son. So for us, what do? Well, here you bring them to the leaders. And one application would be if they are professing Christians and members of the church, they go before the elders of the church to deal with their sinful rebellion. But since we're not a theocracy, there's also civil government, and that means that you let the police do their job. And if your children disobey the law as much as you feel, and I just watched this happen over again, where parents do everything they can to keep their teenage children from experiencing the consequences of breaking the law, all that's doing is failing to train the child that your choices have consequences, and often leads to worse behavior because they did all this bad stuff and their parents got them off. Let him experience the consequence of what he has done. That's what government is for. And that means that if the 16-year-old comes at the mom with a knife, you probably need to call 911 and have the police take him away. Now that I said that, it sounds, as a mother, that's going to be hard to take. And it can become necessary to put them out of the house. If they are adults, you kick them out. I'm not saying every time, but for certain things. And then if they're minors, sometimes, and we've had many cases of this, where they have ranches and other such places where, if they're not in the juvenile system, and right now in the juvenile system there has to be blood on the floor multiple times, at least in Southern California, before they will do anything. It's not like the old days when they were more cooperative with parents. But you may have, we've had cases where they send them to this ranch, this camp, whatever. And the case of the 16-year-old guy who threatened his mom with a knife, two security guards came and picked him up at like 5 a.m. and took him, whether he liked it or not, to a new place where he was going to live. His parents were paying for. Sometimes the church has helped in those situations where they would not put up with what he was doing. It's not a place of torture or anything like that, and probably they won't have any of these in California anymore, but there are some in other states. Texas comes to mind. So, what is your goal? Why would anybody get to this? Again, it's an extreme. It should be a rarity. But the goal would be to protect those who remain. Because this person, again, the mom's at risk physically, the other kids are at risk spiritually. Your hope is, just like church discipline, the goal is that somebody would repent and come back. You've delivered him over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, and he repents. And then we'll probably do the adult parent thing in terms of when do you let him come back. Dealing with the difference between true repentance and false repentance would be really important. I've even had cases where you've got the girl, 18-year-old, whatever, and she's in rebellion, and she goes off and lives with her boyfriend, and then her boyfriend doesn't want her around anymore, or he's a horrible boyfriend, and now she wants to come home, but she wants to come home entirely on her terms. My advice is don't give in to those terms. And that'll come up more after lunch in terms of if they're going to live in your house, you need to establish your own standards. So, in summary, before we have lunch, there is hope. The parable of the prodigal son in the Bible is a picture of God's love for us. But you've also got to think that parents love reading that, parents of prodigals, because it gives hope. You could develop that a little bit. The father of the prodigal son would have done him no good to send him more money while he was in the far country, which is what some parents do. But God sometimes does in real life what's in the parable, where God sometimes through hardship brings kids to their senses and they come back. And I have many, many stories. Part of writing these books is people love to tell their stories. Some of them are really hard and sad. Some of them are delightful, where you hear of the family who did make their 18-year-old leave the home, and after about a week and a half, when life wasn't quite as wonderful on the outside as he thought, God broke him and he repented. He became a Christian. That was like 30 years ago in this one case. Now that guy actually has gone into the vocation of dealing with troubled, rebellious youth. So there are many wonderful stories like that. But even then, your hope is not that your kids will be what you want them to be. My kids will all be in their 30s soon, and God has blessed us with good relationships with each son and their others, wife, and whatever else. And we love them, and thankfully they love us. Even that's a gift from God. We haven't seen them yet come to faith. We still hope, we pray, we look for opportunity. But loving someone who breaks your heart loving someone who doesn't respond to that love. Again, for me, it's been the hardest experience in my life, which I'll talk about trials tomorrow, but it's also been the opportunity in my life where I most know Christ-like love. The Bible tells me to love my wife as Christ loves the church, but my wife loves me so well, it's not that. I don't have to love her so sacrificially, in my opinion. It's pretty easy. Loving my kids, on the other hand, is really hard. To love someone who breaks your heart, who disappoints you, and that teaches me more than anything else I've experienced about how God loves me. And for that, I'm thankful. Amen.